Last August, we asked more than 3,000 Americans about their thoughts and opinions on the First Amendment in the 21st century. Our respondents came from every corner of the country and spanned age, gender, race, and income levels, a true representation of our diverse nation. And though their backgrounds and beliefs are different, we found one belief that unites almost everyone. They overwhelmingly see the First Amendment as vital. Hello, I'm Jan Newhart, Chair and CEO of the Freedom Forum. Through a landmark survey called The First Amendment, Where America Stands, we provide an in-depth look at how people's values shape their attitudes about the First Amendment. At a time when record numbers of people are using their First Amendment freedoms of speech, assembly, and petition to push for social change or oppose it, the survey found that many Americans are conflicted about what those freedoms mean and why they matter in a world deeply different than when the First Amendment was enacted more than 200 years ago. Today, we look forward to sharing the perspectives of some of the people from across the country who participated in the survey and answering some questions they had about the First Amendment. But before we get there, we're going to take a few minutes to share more about what we learned through the Where America Stands survey and how our country truly feels about the 5 freedoms. Kevin Goldberg, the Freedom Forum's First Amendment specialist, will walk us through some of the big picture findings.
As you've already heard, the majority of Americans, an overwhelming 94%, believe the First Amendment is vital. In addition to this important finding that support for the First Amendment remains strong, here are some other key takeaways. Despite how folks feel about the importance of the First Amendment, most people can't identify all 5 freedoms even when presented with a list of options. As we can see, freedom of speech is the most known freedom, followed by religion, press, assembly, and then petition. When we asked which freedom people valued most, 41% of Americans said all 5 are equally important. But for people who selected a specific freedom, twice as many thought speech was most vital, followed by religion. The numbers drop off pretty dramatically from there to petition, press, and assembly. There are differences in knowledge and opinion when it comes to applying the freedoms in practice. For example, a strong majority, 93%, correctly understand that the First Amendment applies to federal, state, and local governments. But 74% incorrectly believe that the First Amendment applies to private workplaces. It doesn't. Just a third of people, 34%, know that some of the highest profile employees, professional athletes, can be fired for their political activity. Now let's take a look at some standout findings with regard to each of the freedoms. Free speech topped most lists when compared to the other freedoms, from most identifiable to most vital. But some people think it should be limited. More than 2/3 believe the government should ban falsehoods or misinformation, at least in some areas such as political advertisements. This would likely violate the First Amendment in most instances. More than half of people know that hate speech is protected by the First Amendment, and more than 1/3 say protecting hate speech is more important than preserving free speech. And in what may be a sign of our divisive times, when it comes to speaking their minds in public, more than 4 in 10 people say that they have, at least once, kept their opinion quiet for fear of being punished or penalized, and almost half have never shared their political views on social media. The ability to believe and worship, or not, as we please is a fundamental First Amendment freedom. But Americans are divided on whether business owners should be able to refuse customer requests that violate their religious beliefs. 37% of people say business owners should fulfill customer requests, but another 37% say the owner should have the right to choose, with the rest undecided. Here's a surprising fact about the right to assembly. Even though it has a relatively high rate of recognition, nearly 69% of people say they've never participated in a protest rally or public march. Relevant to current events, a quarter of the country said that government mandates related to the COVID-19 pandemic, like social distancing and mask requirements, infringed on First Amendment rights of religion, speech, and assembly. Though respondents had a free press near the bottom of the list of most vital freedoms when ranked individually, more than half think a free press should be the watchdog to hold the powerful accountable. But only 14% of them actually trust journalists, and 41% say journalists are a threat to the First Amendment. Remember how we noted that Americans can recognize the right to assembly but rarely use it? Well, the opposite seems to be true for right to petition. It ranked last on our list of freedoms that Americans could identify. In fact, more people incorrectly thought the right to vote was protected by the First Amendment than were able to correctly identify petition. Yet, people use it quite often. Nearly 3/4 of Americans say they've signed a petition. While attitudes about how the First Amendment should play out vary depending on who you ask, 63% of Americans said they would ratify it again today. Though it's troubling to know that 23% would not, 54% say it should not be changed, and 78% of Americans think all countries should have the same freedoms we do. In other words, despite the fundamental divides about what our First Amendment freedoms mean in today's world, to the extent that some of us would even limit them, it remains valued and vital. You can find a full report of our survey results at whereamericastands.org, where you can download much more of our findings. But now let's hear from some of the people who took our survey and agreed to share their thoughts and opinions on the First Amendment with us.
I value the First Amendment because I think it's the pillars of democracy.
It is a prescription for how we should behave.
It's a mandate, really, because it's required in our lives.
It teaches me how to respect others and also expect to be respected in return.
It protects my rights as a United States citizen.
Everybody should have the right to speak their truth.
Without it, America wouldn't be America.
I think we can agree to disagree.
Hate speech needs to have limitations.
Conservative voices get censored, liberal voices don't.
All the freedoms in the First Amendment ride on having the ability to speak our minds and to voice our opinions freely.
If we don't speak up, we'll be overlooked. And things won't ever change.
I need to be able to express myself during a pride parade, during a job interview, for healthcare.
Freedom of speech is more than just speech. It encompasses the freedom of expression as well.
You can talk amicably or agree to disagree, but when it becomes violent and harassing, then that's where the boundaries need to be drawn.
I don't like some of the speech that is considered to be free.
I don't think hate speech should necessarily be protected, but people should still have freedom of speech.
People have hated people for years and years. Heck, if you were at Salem and you didn't like somebody, you call them a witch, and next thing you know, they're being dunked in a river.
People get offended for many different things. You never know.
I don't want your opinion, I just want news, I want the facts. Bias is really hard to avoid. We're humans, it's in our nature.
A lot of the media is very irresponsible when they distort the truth as fact.
Freedom of the press gives me information, and that's power.
You have to take everything with a grain of salt, and you just gotta find the truth.
Sometimes they stretch the truth, and I don't think that that's right.
I believe the media has taken the term freedom of press too far, because yes, you have a right to say what you believe is the truth, but facts are not the same as the truth.
There's no such thing as alternative facts. Facts are facts. Facts are facts. And I don't know when we decided that that wasn't true.
We need different sources of news so that we can compare and contrast and feel like we're getting all the information.
This is our country in actual operation the way it should be.
Let the people have their say and punish those who cannot follow the laws.
I think everyone has a right to protest, especially peacefully.
Freedom of assembly means you go, you meet, you talk, you present, and then you leave.
A protest that does not go to the source of power and understand power and understand how to meet power with power will fail.
Probably 90-95% of the people are just protesting peacefully. The mainstream media doesn't portray that. They want the violence because that's the ratings and that's what's going to get the clicks, and that's sad.
There's a big difference between peacefully assemble, which is what it says, and go out and start busting windows, burning cars.
It's mostly violent. That's why I don't really feel safe about doing protests.
I think it should be limited to a certain amount of people being able to participate. 50 to 100 people, not a whole city of people.
America was built on protests. I mean, it just was. We threw tea into Boston Harbor. That was a protest.
Of all the freedoms, religion is the most individual.
I prefer to practice my religion, you practice yours.
In my life is very important, the freedom of religion, because in this house I have one religion and my husband have a different religion. And my son maybe will have a third religion.
Let's face it, that's kind of why the Pilgrims came here. They were escaping religious persecution.
I really don't want any government trying to tell me how to believe or who to believe or if I even should believe.
What I find troubling with freedom of religion is when someone else uses their religion to try and control my behavior.
I'm a very active member of my current religious congregation. So take away freedom of religion, and that's a huge chunk of my life that would be affected.
Freedom of petition is the safety valve.
There's a way that we can leverage our position as citizens.
That helps our voices be heard.
Redress of grievances is very important, because if you don't like a tyrannical government, you're supposed to be able to address that.
The right to petition the government focuses the government on who they represent.
The right to bring up a particular issue for a government entity or a particular ruling body.
Voting makes me emotional, because it's such a privilege and an honor. Oh, and anyone who... And I'm sad for anyone who doesn't understand that and take full advantage of letting their voice be heard.
I'm able to leverage my position as someone who lives in that local community and to make my voice heard. Because otherwise, ultimately, these decisions won't get made without you.
The government is not giving the population a gift by saying, oh yeah, you can come and complain. No, I'm not complaining. I have this right. It's an inalienable right.
Hello, I'm Lucy Dalglish. I'm the Dean of the Philip Merrill College of Journalism here at the University of Maryland and a trustee of the Freedom Forum Institute. Learning 3,000 Americans' thoughts about the First Amendment helped answer some of the Freedom Forum's questions about where people stand and what they value. But what about the questions Americans have about their rights and freedoms? We wanted to find out what questions people have about the First Amendment. And today, our experts are going to answer some of them. One question concerned free speech on college campuses. The survey found that most people think college campuses should foster a free expression of ideas, even if those ideas are offensive to some. But 36% of people think colleges and universities represent an actual threat to the First Amendment. That may be a reflection of efforts by students, administrators, and even lawmakers to curtail speech that represents controversial perspectives or speech that harasses or intimidates individuals. It's an issue that sometimes plays out here at the University of Maryland, where on occasion there's a collision between free speech and people advocating for diversity, equity, and inclusion, or other social justice issues. They feel some ideas are just not up for debate. So our first question will be answered by David Hudson, a First Amendment Fellow at the Freedom Forum. David, does the First Amendment protect students who wish to shout down speakers whose ideas they find repugnant?
Thanks, Lucy. That's an excellent question. I'm speaking to you from Belmont University College of Law in Nashville, Tennessee. No, students generally do not have a First Amendment right to shout down public speakers. Such activity would cause a substantial disruption of school activities and impose a heckler's veto upon the speaker and the event. Students also don't have a First Amendment right to utter true threats or engage in targeted harassment. Of course, students retain the right to exercise their First Amendment freedoms peacefully. The preferred First Amendment remedy is what Justice Louis Brandeis famously referred to in Whitney versus California in 1927 as, quote, more speech, not enforced silence.
Bora Kim has a question about the relevance of the First Amendment today.
Is there a way we can imagine the First Amendment being amenable to the time that we live in today? And how can we find relevance in the way they were written, perhaps, or in the way they were phrased or framed? Maybe that's a rhetorical question, but I just feel like I want to ask that of our experts.
The First Amendment applies to government actors, and social media platforms, they're private companies, so they're not government actors. But the same concept holds true, that we need to think about where we're getting our information from and why we pay attention to the things that we do pay attention to, because it has huge repercussions for us as a society where we decide to direct our attention.
Our next question is about limits on free speech and free expression from Elisa Williams.
Where's the line drawn as far as where their expressions are infringing upon another's rights?
Elisa, thank you for your very good question. Well, the First Amendment provides broad protection for freedom of speech, including speech that may be unpopular or even offensive. Now, this protection from government interference with free speech sometimes extends even to acts intended to convey some political or religious message. Now, flag burning is a good example. At the same time, the Supreme Court has drawn some lines around freedom of speech when that speech directly threatens or interferes with the rights of others. Advocating imminent lawless action, for example, is not protected speech. Freedom of expression can be messy, sometimes offensive, but ensuring the right to express our religious and political views openly and freely is the cornerstone of a democratic society.
Now we have a question from Ramon Marino about threats to the First Amendment.
I want to know what protections we could put in place to protect our First Amendment rights from threats.
Tough question. I do have an easy answer, and that is that we should absolutely not amend the First Amendment to create new exceptions to the five freedoms. Look, after 200 years of adapting to changing norms and new technologies, the First Amendment ain't broke, so let's not try to fix it. And I realize that may not be what you were looking for. So here's some other ideas. We can pass new laws to help where needed. Remember, the First Amendment limits the government from restricting our freedoms. It doesn't prevent the government from offering us more. We should increase education about the First Amendment to promote widespread respect for the freedoms and to spur continued societal demand for its protection. And finally, we must fight to preserve the rule of law, especially in the courts, to ensure that overzealous government officials don't try to restrict our rights on a whim.
Narda Gise has a question about speech and cancel culture.
How are you going to control that really freedom of speech will be protected for both sides, for the people who are right and the people who are wrong? How are they going to protect it? How are they going to control the social media don't cancel some people because think different?
It's a natural tendency to think that the First Amendment protects the speech that you like, and that somehow there are limits and exceptions to it when it comes to the speech that you dislike. And while that might be natural and that might be human nature, it's not the best argument that you can make. Because if you advocate for laws and policies that suppress speech that you dislike, sooner or later, those laws and policies will be used to suppress your speech or speech that you agree with. When it comes to social media, that's not the government, and technically the First Amendment doesn't apply there, but it still follows the same theme that if we condition social media companies to respond to our outrage and censor content based on that, then we have to keep in mind that while that maybe sometimes that is appropriate, but eventually there will come a time when there is outrage against speech that you think needs to be protected. And so it cuts both ways. I think it's important to remember that the First Amendment, and in a larger sense, free expression, refers to not just the speech that we think is right and good, but all speech.
Our next question is from Alexandria Flint, who wonders about the intent of our nation's founders.
I would really just like to know more about why those specific rights were chosen. You know, I've talked about how I feel about it, but just knowing more about the Founding Fathers' perspective and what they were thinking when they wrote that First Amendment would be really interesting.
Thanks, Alexandra, for being curious about what the founders had in mind. You know, most Americans today name speech or religion as the most essential freedoms, but the founders considered assembly and petition the most important because they thought those two freedoms would protect the rest of them. Many of our founders used events and essays from as much as 500 years earlier to shape their thoughts. Their strong views on the right to assemble and petition the government for change drew from the writings of English philosopher John Locke. They prized an individual's right to speak their minds to the powerful, using the Magna Carta from 1215 as inspiration. And they argued for an individual's personal right to determine religious beliefs and for a free press, ideas both rooted in a 1644 essay, Areopagitica, by the English poet John Milton. In the end, it was James Madison who drafted the 45 words of the First Amendment, unchanged so far since 1791. And even though he first thought amendments to the Constitution weren't needed, eventually Madison agreed with others that our core freedoms need to be spelled out if they're to be protected.
Our final question for our experts comes from Greg Wills.
What makes the First Amendment so important overall?
The highest purpose of free expression is to change things, to change society. And the First Amendment contains 5 different freedoms, and all of them go towards that purpose. You have the freedom of the press, which allows you to get uncensored information about the world around you. And you have freedom of religion, which allows you to develop your own values. Freedom of speech lets you express your values, even when they're critical of the systems of government and the people in power. And then you have freedom of petition and assembly, which allow you to gather with like-minded people and actually ask for the change that you want. And that's why the First Amendment is so important. They're our most vital tools to actually having and living in society that we want.
The First Amendment is just the ultimate embodiment of feeling free. In addition to being able to say what I want to say, I can read what I want to read, watch what I want to watch, listen to what I want to listen to. Now, I may not want to read a particular book, watch a particular television program or movie, or listen to a particular song or podcast at any given moment. But it's an exceedingly comforting feeling to know that my book or show or movie or song or podcast that I want to listen to is there when I want it.
The 5 freedoms protected by the First Amendment are what define us as a nation, unique in the world and unique in history. In the founders' view, it was absolutely essential for a self-governing nation for citizens to be able to freely discuss, debate, and decide on the best possible solutions for the greatest number of people. Our First Amendment freedoms make democracy work.
All of our liberties flow from the First Amendment. By exercising freedoms of speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition, Americans have expanded civil rights and worked to create a more just and free society. Simply put, no significant movement for change in our history would have been possible without the 5 freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment. Of course, we still have much work to do. But thanks to the First Amendment, Americans are protected to advance the ongoing struggle to achieve liberty and justice for all.
Hearing from Americans across the country,
reminds us that while we are divided on many things, the First Amendment continues to unite us, which is why our vision of an America where everyone knows, understands, values, and defends the freedoms of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition is more important than ever. We want a growing number of Americans to understand why the First Amendment matters in the 21st century and what it means for them. We want to fortify support for free speech and fight the misinformation that weakens it. We want to build an appreciation for the role that a free press plays in protecting our freedoms. And we want to increase understanding of and respect for religious freedom. There is plenty of work to do, but we now know we are building on a foundation where an overwhelming majority of Americans see the First Amendment as vital and valued, and that gives us hope for the future. Please check out our survey results at whereamericastands.org and follow us at First for All on Twitter and Instagram and at First Amendment for All on Facebook as we unpack more details from our survey in the weeks to come. We are aiming to reach 330 million Americans in their homes, online, on the playground, at the synagogue, wherever they may be, as we continue our work to foster First Amendment freedoms for all. Thank you.